In the spring of 1944, a small farming village in northern France lived under the quiet strain of occupation. The war felt distant but constant, present in ration cards, curfews, and the absence of young men. Nights were dark by necessity, windows covered, lanterns dimmed. Livestock barns stood at the edge of the village, housing animals that had become more valuable than ever. Horses, in particular, were essential pulling carts, plowing fields, and replacing vehicles lost to fuel shortages. On one such evening, the distant sound of aircraft engines broke the silence. Air raids were not unusual, but they usually targeted rail lines and depots miles away. That night, however, weather and navigation errors altered the outcome. Incendiary bombs fell closer than expected. Within moments, explosions echoed across the fields, and fire rose where no one had prepared to face it. One of the first structures hit was a wooden livestock barn filled with dry hay and farming equipment. The barn ignited almost instantly. Flames climbed the walls, fed by wind and age-dried timber. Smoke poured through gaps in the wood, thick and blinding. Villagers rushed toward the fire, but were forced back by heat and collapsing beams. Inside the barn were several horses, requisitioned earlier in the war for agricultural and transport work. Civil defense records from occupied France confirm that such fires were often fatal, as animals trapped by instinct rarely escaped once smoke-filled, enclosed spaces. According to multiple post-war testimonies, movement inside the barn changed the outcome. One horse, stabled closest to the main door, began pushing repeatedly against the wooden barrier. Whether driven by panic or training from years of farm labor, the animal continued pressing forward as flames weakened the structure. Hinges loosened under heat, the door groaned, then partially collapsed outward. The horse burst into the open air, coughing and covered in soot. Instead of fleeing immediately, it turned back toward the opening, circling near the flames. Seconds later, other horses followed through the broken doorway, escaping just before the roof caved inward. No human entered the barn during the fire. The escape happened quickly, instinctively, and without coordination. The loss of those horses would have carried serious consequences. Horses were vital to food production and local transport, especially under occupation. Their survival meant fields could still be worked and supplies still moved. In wartime France, that difference could determine whether families endured the coming months. As the barn collapsed into embers, the village stood in stunned silence. There was no celebration, only relief. The horse stood apart from the others, breathing heavily, steam rising from its coat. No official report recorded its actions. No name was given, but everyone present understood the same truth that night. Without that moment at the door, the outcome would have been far worse. And as smoke drifted into the dark sky, the war revealed one of its quietest lessons of survival. Sometimes arrived without warning, carried by instinct rather than command. When morning came, the village no longer smelled of smoke alone, but of loss narrowly avoided. Where the barn had stood, only blackened beams and smoldering ash remained. Farmers gathered quietly, assessing damage without words. Inoccupied France recovery began immediately or not at all. The horses that had escaped were led to makeshift shelters, their value suddenly magnified. Without them, the village's ability to function would have been crippled. German occupation authorities arrived later that day to document the destruction. Their reports focused on property loss and potential sabotage, not on animals or civilians. Witnesses were questioned briefly, then dismissed. No investigation followed. Fires caused by air raids were common enough to warrant little attention unless infrastructure was affected. The survival of the horses went unremarked in official records, despite their strategic importance to both agriculture and transport. For the villagers, however, the meaning was clear. Horses replaced trucks when fuel was unavailable. They carried food to market, hauled firewood, and moved supplies under curfew restrictions. In many rural areas, they were the difference between isolation and survival. Losing them would have forced requisitions from neighboring farms already stretched thin, creating resentment and hunger that spread quickly under occupation. The horse that broke free first showed visible signs of exhaustion in the days that followed. Local farmers treated burns along its coat, using improvised remedies common at the time: cool water, clean cloth, and rest. Veterinary access was limited, but wartime agricultural manuals emphasized preservation of working animals whenever possible. The horse recovered slowly, remaining functional when needed, though never pushed unnecessarily. As word spread quietly between villages, the story changed shape. Some spoke of instinct, others of training. No one exaggerated the event openly. Such attention could invite unwanted scrutiny. Still, the incident became a reminder of how fragile survival had become, not just for people, but for the systems that sustained them. One broken door had preserved an entire chain of labor. Weeks later, requisition orders arrived, demanding horses for transport use nearer the front. This time, the village could comply without collapse. Had the barn fire taken its course, refusal or resistance might have followed choices that often carried severe consequences. Survival, in this context, was not dramatic. It was administrative, logistical, and moral all at once. The horse returned to work as the season changed, pulling plows across fields scarred lightly by bomb fragments. Life resumed its fragile rhythm. Yet for those who had stood helpless before the flames, the memory remained sharp. War was not only fought with weapons and strategies, but with endurance measured in animals saved, fields planted, and nights survived. What no one could know then was that this single moment, ignored by authorities and absent from reports, had preserved more than livestock. It had preserved choice, and in wartime Europe, the ability to choose how to survive was already becoming rare. As summer advanced into early autumn of 1944, the war crept closer to the village in ways that were impossible to ignore. The distant thunder of artillery became more frequent, no longer something that passed and faded. Columns of troops moved along secondary roads. Refugees appeared at dawn, asking for water, directions, or a place to rest. What had once been a single night of destruction now felt like the beginning of a longer ordeal. The surviving horses became central to the village's ability to adapt. With rail lines damaged and fuel scarce, animal-drawn carts were once again the most reliable means of transport. Fields still needed tending, despite shells falling miles away. Food deliveries to nearby towns continued under stricter curfews. The same horse that had forced its way out of the burning barn was now worked carefully. Assigned to shorter routes, its strength preserved rather than exploited. German requisition patrols returned more frequently. Horses were counted, inspected, and recorded. Each visit carried tension. Losing even one animal would weaken the village. Esse fragile balance. Farmers spoke cautiously, presenting their livestock as overworked and barely functional. Wartime agricultural guidance from the period confirms that exaggerating animal fatigue was a common survival tactic, used to delay or avoid seizure without open defiance. The horse itself showed a calm that villagers found unsettling. Loud noises no longer startled it. Smoke from distant fires barely drew its attention. Whether this was adaptation or exhaustion was impossible to know. What mattered was reliability. In uncertain times, predictability became a form of safety. Children were warned not to approach it suddenly. Adults treated it with quiet respect, as if drawing attention might invite misfortune. As Allied advances accelerated after the Normandy landings, the village found itself caught between retreating forces and approaching ones. Orders shifted without clarity. Roads opened, then closed. Through it all, the horses continued to move supplies quietly, avoiding main routes when possible. Civilian survival depended on remaining useful without becoming visible. One evening, as the horse returned from a delivery, aircraft passed overhead again. This time, no bombs fell nearby. Still, the villagers froze, memory rising faster than reason. When the sound faded, work resumed without discussion. Fear had become routine. Survival no longer required courage, only endurance, repeated daily. By the end of the season, it was clear that the fire had marked a turning point, not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed how thin the margin had become. The village survived, not through resistance or escape, but through continuity. Fields were planted, carts rolled, animals worked. And among them, one horse carried more than weight. It carried the village's ability to keep going while the war tightened around them. By late 1944, the village no longer belonged fully to itself. German patrols passed through with increasing frequency, not as occupiers settling in, but as forces retreating and reorganizing. Their behavior had changed. Orders were shorter. Inspections more hurried. Tension replaced routine. For civilians, this shift was dangerous. Retreating armies were often less predictable than advancing ones, and mistakes were paid for immediately. The horses were now under constant scrutiny. Lists were updated, numbers compared. Any discrepancy invited questions no one wanted to answer. The villagers learned to anticipate inspections, positioning animals carefully, sometimes moving them temporarily to nearby farms to avoid appearing well supplied. These methods were quiet and coordinated, relying on trust rather than open resistance. Survival depended on not standing out. The horse that had escaped the burning barn was now fully recovered, though its coat still bore faint marks from smoke and heat. It was assigned tasks that mattered most: hauling grain, transporting firewood, moving goods between farms under cover of routine. Its reliability made it indispensable. At the same time, that reliability made it vulnerable to requisition. Every journey carried risk, not from the animal failing, but from being noticed. Villagers faced a moral tension that wartime diaries often describe with restraint. Cooperation kept families fed, refusal invited punishment. Between those extremes existed a narrow space where small decisions mattered. Choosing which horse went where, deciding when to delay a delivery, knowing when to comply quickly and when to slow down just enough to remain useful without becoming exposed. The horse became part of those calculations, not as a symbol, but as a practical factor in every choice. As winter approached again, the sound of artillery moved closer, then farther, then closer once more. Front lines shifted unpredictably. One night, distant explosions lit the horizon briefly, followed by silence. The barn fire returned to memory uninvited. People checked doors. Animals were brought closer to homes. Preparedness had become instinctive, shaped by one night that had nearly taken everything. German units passed through the village shortly after, moving west. They took little this time. Fuel mattered more than livestock now. The horses remained for the moment. No one celebrated. Experience had taught them that survival was temporary, always subject to revision. What mattered was readiness, not relief. Through these months, the horse continued to work quietly, pulling carts through mud and frost, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. That anonymity was protection. The villages understood that survival during war was rarely dramatic. It was measured in continuity. Fields, workhead supplies moved, nights endured. The barn no longer stood, but its absence shaped everything that followed. It reminded the village that one moment could erase years of labor, and it reinforced a truth they now lived by daily. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on choices made quietly, repeatedly, and under watchful eyes that never stayed for long. By early 1945, the village existed in a state of constant calculation. Liberation felt close enough to imagine, yet distant enough to remain dangerous. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Some said Allied units were only days away. Others warned of renewed fighting before any relief arrived. For civilians, uncertainty was no longer emotional, it was operational. Every decision carried weight, and every mistake could be final. The horses had become the village's backbone. With rail lines disrupted and vehicles scarce, nearly all movement depended on animal transport. Grain deliveries, medical supplies, and firewood moved along narrow paths where carts blended into routine. The horse that had escaped the burning barn was now relied upon almost daily, not because it was stronger than the others, but because it never faltered. That dependability, however, created its own danger. German units passing through the region were increasingly desperate. Requisitions became inconsistent, sometimes aggressive, sometimes absent. Officers rotated quickly, leaving orders half-formed and enforcement uneven. Villagers learned to read these changes carefully. A well-fed horse could attract attention. A tired one might be spared. The balance between usefulness and visibility narrowed with each passing week. The horse's workload was adjusted deliberately. Farmers shortened routes, added rest days, and rotated tasks to avoid drawing notice. These decisions were not acts of kindness alone. They were strategic. Wartime agricultural guidance emphasized preserving working animals as long-term assets. Losing one could disrupt food production for months. The villagers understood this instinctively. The horse's survival meant their own. Moral pressure intensified as shortages worsened. Requests came from neighboring villages: "Sparrow, a horse, move supplies, help evacuate families." Each request was justified. Each carried risk. Saying yes could expose them. Saying no could condemn others. The horse stood at the center of these decisions, not as a choice, but as the means through which choices became possible. The villagers learned that neutrality was rarely an option. Survival required engagement, measured carefully and quietly. One evening, a German patrol stopped the horse mid-route, questioning its handler about destination and cargo. The exchange lasted minutes that felt longer than the night of the fire. Papers were inspected. The horse stood motionless, breathing steadily. Eventually, the patrol waved them on. Nothing had happened. Everything had almost happened. That distinction defined life under occupation. As winter loosened its grip, signs of change multiplied. Aircraft passed overhead more frequently. Distant gunfire shifted direction. Patrols thinned, then vanished 4 days at a time. By late winter of 1945, the village had learned that silence itself could be a form of defense. Information was power, and power attracted attention. People spoke less, asked fewer questions, and avoided explaining routines that had become essential to survival. Movements were planned quietly and adjusted constantly. The horse continued its work, but always within patterns that appeared ordinary short trips, familiar routes, predictable timing. Anything unusual risked scrutiny. German presence became irregular. Some days, no patrols appeared at all. On others, small groups passed through quickly, uninterested in control and focused only on retreat. This unpredictability made decisions harder, not easier. Villagers could not rely on habit alone. Each morning required reassessment. Who was nearby? What roads were open? Which tasks could wait? The horse's assignments were adjusted daily, reflecting this constant recalculation. The memory of the barn fire never fully faded. It shaped how people reacted to every distant engine and every unexplained glow on the horizon. Precautions multiplied. Animals were stabled closer to homes. Buckets of water were kept ready. Escape routes were discussed quietly, then set aside. Preparation had become instinctive, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Survival now depended on anticipating loss before it arrived. The horse remained central to these preparations. Its calm demeanor influenced those around it. During tense moments, unexpected inspections, sudden questions stood quietly, unmoving. That steadiness mattered. Panic attracted attention. Calm deflected it. The villagers learned to mirror the animal's behavior, responding slowly, answering simply, never offering more than was asked. In war, restraint could be as effective as resistance. Requests for help continued to arrive discreetly. A nearby farm, needy grain moved before inspection. Another asked for assistance transporting supplies after dark. Each request forced a choice. The horse could not be everywhere. Overuse increased risk. Refusal carried moral weight. Decisions were made collectively, balancing need against exposure. The horse enabled survival not only through labor, but by forcing these decisions to be considered carefully rather than impulsively. As weeks passed, signs of German withdrawal became clearer. Equipment was abandoned. Checkpoints disappeared. Orders stopped arriving. The danger did not vanish, but it changed shape. Chaos replaced control. For civilians, this phase was often the most dangerous. Authority weakened, but desperation increased. The villagers understood this instinctively. They remained cautious, maintaining routines until change was undeniable. Through it all, the horse continued to work quietly, neither celebrated nor discussed. Its value lay in continuity, not drama. It did not represent hope or defiance. It represented function. And in a war where survival often depended on function rather than force, that distinction mattered. As the season shifted again, the village sensed that the long tension was nearing its end. Yet no one allowed relief to alter behavior. Silence remained protection. Routine remained safety, and the horse, steady, unnoticed, indispensable, remained at the center of it all, carrying not only loads, but the fragile balance that kept the village alive. The first clear sign that everything was changing came not with celebration, but with absence. One morning, the road that usually carried patrols remained empty well past noon. No boots, no shouted orders, no sudden inspections. The village noticed immediately, yet no one reacted openly. Experience had taught them that hope expressed too early could be punished. Still, the silence felt differently there, uncertain, almost fragile. By afternoon, distant sounds replaced routine tension. Artillery no longer echoed from the same direction. Instead, movement flowed the other way, columns retreating, equipment abandoned along secondary roads, refugees returning cautiously rather than fleeing. The villagers understood what this meant, even before confirmation arrived. The front was shifting decisively. Occupation was loosening its grip, though not yet gone. The horse continued its work that day, pulling a small cart of grain along a familiar route. Nothing about the task was unusual, and that was intentional. Sudden changes invited attention, yet something subtle had changed. The handler noticed fewer eyes watching from doorways, fewer pauses along the road. The war had not ended, but its pressure had thinned enough to breathe. That evening, the first Allied scouts passed through the outskirts of the village. There was no announcement, no ceremony, just a brief exchange of information and a request for directions. The villagers answered carefully, aware that uncertainty still lingered. Liberation was a process, not a moment. Still, the meaning was unmistakable. The long period of calculated silence was ending. The horse reacted no differently than before. It stood calmly as unfamiliar uniforms passed, ears turning briefly. Its steadiness, once essential to survival, now carried a different meaning. For months, it had helped the village endure without drawing notice. Now, it represented continuity, the idea that life could resume without collapse. That night, conversations resumed quietly in kitchens and barns. Not celebrations, but plans, repairs that could finally begin. Fields that could be expanded, routes that no longer needed to be hidden. The barn fire returned to memory again, not as fear this time, but as a marker of how close everything had come to ending before it could change. The horse was fed well that night, brushed longer than usual, then left undisturbed. No one spoke of what it had done. There was no need. Survival had been collective, built from small decisions made repeatedly under pressure. The horse had been part of that system, not above it, not symbolic, just essential. As dawn approached, the village stood on the edge of transition. The war was not yet finished, but its shadow was lifting. The routines that had once protected them would soon be replaced by rebuilding, memory, and reckoning. And at the center of that fragile passage stood the same quiet solution that had carried them through fire, fear, and silence, now waiting, as it always had, for whatever came next. Liberation did not arrive as a single, clean moment. It unfolded unevenly, day by day, marked by new uniforms on old roads and unfamiliar orders delivered with caution. Allied units moved through the region carefully, aware that retreating forces could still cause harm. For the village, the danger had changed shape rather than disappeared. Survival was no longer about invisibility alone, but about adjustment, learning how to exist openly again without inviting new risks. Civil authorities returned gradually, often improvised from those who had remained in place throughout occupation. Assessments were made, damage recorded, livestock counted. The burned barn became part of an official report, listed as loss due to air activity. No details followed, no mention of the animals that escaped. For administration, outcomes mattered more than process. For villagers, memory filled the gaps left by paperwork. the horse resumed work under new conditions. Its routes expanded beyond the village for the first time in months, hauling supplies to nearby towns, now reconnecting to larger networks. Roads once avoided became usable again. Checkpoints dissolved. Still, habits formed under occupation did not vanish overnight. Movements remained cautious. Loads remained modest. The instinct to avoid attention lingered even when attention no longer carried the same threat. Allied officers conducting logistics surveys noted the condition of local animals, recommending continued use until mechanized transport could be restored. Wartime records show how rural areas depended heavily on horses well into the post-liberation period. Fuel shortages did not end with occupation. Infrastructure repair took time. In Tatsensei, the horse's role did not conclude with freedom. It evolved. Survival gave way to recovery, but continuity remained essential. Moral questions surfaced as the village reconnected with the outside world. Who had cooperated too openly? Who had resisted too quietly? Who had simply endured? These discussions were careful, often private. The barn fire was mentioned occasionally, not as accusation or praise, but as a reminder. It marked a night when outcomes had been decided by circumstance rather than choice. Judgments felt smaller in comparison. The horse stood apart from these debates. It had no record to defend or explain. Its value had been practical, not political. That neutrality mattered. In a time when lines were redrawn quickly, neutrality offered stability. Children approached it more freely now, curiosity replacing caution. Adults watched with mixed relief and restraint, aware that habits of protection were slow to fade. As spring progressed, rebuilding began in earnest. The remains of the burned barn were cleared. Plans were discussed for a new structure, sturdier, less vulnerable. The horse worked nearby, hauling timber and stone. Each load felt like quiet closure. The village had endured fire, scrutiny, and silence. Now it faced responsibility, remembering without being consumed, rebuilding without forgetting. The war's end would bring its own challenges, but for the village, the transition had already begun. Survival had been the first task. Living openly again was the next. And at the center of that passage remained the same steady presence, no longer a secret safeguard, but a working part of recovery, carrying forward what endurance had made possible. As liberation stabilized across the region, the village entered a period of reckoning that felt quieter than the months of danger, yet no less demanding. Survival had required discipline and restraint. Recovery required memory and choice. Committees formed to record losses, redistribute resources, and re-establish trade. Lists were made: fields damaged, tools missing, animals remaining. The burned barn appeared again in official paperwork, reduced to numbers and dates. What it represented to those who had lived through that night could not be written so easily. The horse continued to work during this transition, now under conditions that looked almost normal. Carts traveled farther. Markets reopened. Requests arrived from towns rebuilding their own supply lines. Allied transport was still uneven, and animals filled the gaps. Wartime logistics studies later noted how rural horsepower bridged the months between liberation and mechanization. In practice, this meant long days and careful pacing. The horse was used steadily, never rushed, its value understood more clearly than ever. Conversations in the village shifted from caution to meaning. People spoke about what they had done to survive and what they wished they had done differently. Cooperation, compliance. Delage carried its own weight. The barn fire surfaced often in these discussions, not as a moral test, but as a reminder of contingency. Outcomes had hinged on seconds and instinct, not policy. That understanding softened judgments and narrowed accusations. Endurance, they realized, rarely looked clean in retrospect. The horse's presence influenced these reflections in a subtle way. It had crossed every phase without changing its nature, working during occupation, during retreat, during liberation. It had not chosen sides. It had done what it could when needed. For villagers searching for language to describe their own actions, that constancy mattered. Survival was not always resistance or refusal. Sometimes it was continuity under pressure. By early summer, reconstruction plans moved forward. A new barn was approved, built with sturdier materials and improved access. The horse hauled beams and stone, its role now visibly constructive rather than merely sustaining. Each trip felt like progress measured in weight and distance. Children watched from fences. Adults coordinated schedules. The rhythms of work replaced the rhythms of fear, though memory lingered close beneath the surface. Regional authorities conducted final assessments before shifting focus elsewhere. Files were closed. Cases concluded, the war moved on to other headlines. The horse did not appear in any summary, nor did most of the decisions that had preserved the village. History favored outcomes over processes. Those who remained understood the difference. The absence of recognition did not diminish impact. It clarified it. As the new barn took shape, the village sensed closure approaching, not an ending to memory, but an end to improvisation. Survival had been achieved. Recovery was underway. One chapter remained. Not of danger or rebuilding, but of meaning. How to remember a time when endurance depended on choices made quietly, and on one steady solution that had never asked to be noticed. By the time the new barn stood finished, the war had moved decisively beyond the village. News arrived through newspapers and returning soldiers, not through rumors whispered at night. Europe was rebuilding unevenly, carrying scars that would last generations. For this village, the work of recovery had been practical and immediate. Fields replanted, tools repaired, animals counted. Survival had ended as an emergency and become a responsibility. The horse that had broken free during the fire continued to work through this transition, though its pace slowed with age. It hauled timber, grain, and supplies not out of necessity alone, but because alternatives remained scarce. Wartime records confirm that horses remained essential in rural Europe long after the fighting stopped. Fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure made mechanization unreliable. It was spoken of sparingly, usually when someone new asked why the rebuilt structure stood where it did. No one embellished the story. There was no need. The facts were enough. A door gave way. Animals escaped. A village endured. In a war filled with grand narratives, this one stayed deliberately small. Local records from the immediate post-war years focused on outcomes: production restored, losses replaced, taxes resumed. The fire appeared only as a line item. The horse was not mentioned at all. This absence reflected how history often works. Survival systems are visible only when they fail. When they succeed, they disappear into routine. The villagers understood this instinctively. Recognition had never been the goal. Continuity had. As years passed, children who had been warned to stay silent during occupation grew into adults who spoke openly. The horse became part of their understanding of the war, not as legend, but as example. Survival, they learned, was rarely dramatic. It depended on preparation, restraint, and moments when instinct filled the gap left by planning. The fire taught them that outcomes could hinge on seconds rather than strategies. When the horse finally stopped working, it was cared for quietly until the end of its life. No marker recorded its service. No ceremony marked its passing. Yet its impact remained tangible. Fields had been worked. Food had been moved. Choices had been preserved when choices were rare. The village had survived intact enough to rebuild without fracture. That was its legacy. In the end, the story of this horse is not about heroism as history usually defines it. It is about function under pressure, about continuity when systems fail, about how survival often depends on solutions that draw no attention and ask no recognition. The bonfire could have ended everything: food supply, mobility, cooperation. Instead, it revealed what endurance looked like in practice. What the fire ultimately saved was not just animals or labor. It saved time, the time needed for the war to move on, for liberation to arrive, for rebuilding to begin. And in that time, a village remained whole. That is why this story matters, not because it stands out in the records, but because it never needed to.